Hello everybody, welcome. It is Wednesday and I'm not here, but that doesn't mean we have to stop learning. Of course not. Today we have Governomics with Mr. V, even though I'm not here. Creepy. Now here's what we're going to do today. Today we are going to focus in on the government that you and I get to enjoy in this country. We are going to focus in on the United States system. I just walked by my door, awkward. We're going to focus on what we have in our country and call it federalism. So let's go ahead and get into it. All right, here we go. So federalism, it's our system of government. Different from a unitary style, different from a confederate style. It's a nice mix of both. So let's get into it. Here's the thing. If I had been with you today, I was going to pass out a set of maps. And on these maps, which we'll see in a minute, there's all kinds of different information about the United States. Since I'm not there and it'd be awkward to try to do it with the substitute teacher, what I've done instead is I've simply put those maps into this slideshow. So let's go through them really quickly one at a time. The first map here shows the total population broken down by county in the United States. So one thing you might notice is that in counties like ours, which are around Chicago and Milwaukee, you have much darker colors. That means there's a much higher or denser population. Whereas in counties like this one in Nebraska or out here in Nevada, the population is much lower. Interesting. We could make some observations about that. Here's the next map. This map takes note on which states have had the largest change in the number of immigrants since 1990, basically to 2011. Okay, so the data stops at 2011. So the green states have the largest amount of foreign-born people in them when compared to other states. You'll notice Illinois is one of them. So is Texas, obviously California. You can see the others. And then the blue states show the largest amount of growth. So even though they might still have a relatively small amount of foreign-born citizens, they have seen the largest increase in that category since the census information was starting to be taken. Interesting. We can make some observations about this. This third one has to do with health, specifically the obesity rate. So one thing that stands out, well, actually there's two things in my mind. The first thing is that Colorado apparently has no county where anyone is obese. Well, maybe not completely anyone, but there's no county where more than 11.5%, it says down here in the key, in the year 2008, were obese. So apparently they're all just up there in the mountains, like hiking all the time and just being healthy. Meanwhile, down in the South, specifically in states like Mississippi, you have a very serious high rate of obesity. Interesting observations we could make from that. Let's skip through the next few. This one has to do with public transportation use. If you'd like to see this one in greater detail, I would encourage you to pause the video. Again, you see that in places where there are big cities, there's a much greater use of public transportation, which kind of makes sense. Here is the percentage of Americans with a disability. Again, interesting observation about the South. Much higher percentages of individuals with disabilities. Here is the data numbers about high school graduation rates. So in a county like ours, right here, just north of Chicago, we have an 85 to 91% graduation rate. Again, I don't want to keep highlighting it, but the South has a much lower graduation rate, as well as other parts of the country, such as the barren parts of Nevada and parts of New Mexico and Texas. So, the questions that we want to ask about those maps are these kinds of things. What were some of your observations? One thing that stands out to me is that there is a pretty big difference between cities versus rural areas, and there seems to be a lot of differences between the South and the rest of the country. Okay? Those are things that stood out to me. Maybe you had some similar or different observations. Second, what conclusions can we make about our observations? Well, again, there's lots we could say. We could try to explain the causes of why the South has such high obesity as compared to the rest of the country. That would probably go back to issues of poverty, which could go back to issues of culture and even, if we're honest, slavery. But to be honest with you, that would be a discussion I think better had in person. So let's maybe just kind of keep moving. the third question relates to why I bring this up in the issue of federalism. The question is, what problems might these things cause for a government? And what I'm trying to get us to realize here is that a government needs to try to make laws that apply to its citizens, right? Everybody. But in a country like ours, where there's such diversity and where there are such differences between people, let's say, who live in cities versus not living in cities, or people who live in the South and people who don't, and other things we could have talked about, it's going to be really hard for one level of government to make laws that meet the needs of everybody well enough. And so what we're going to see is that we need a different system of government. And that's the potential solution. We need a system of government where we can have a strong national layer to meet the needs of the most people in the broad ways, but we also need smaller local governments that can focus on the issues that are most important or that are very specific to their own people. For instance, we need a government for Mississippi that can focus on the issues of Mississippi, and we need a government for Colorado that can focus on the issues of Colorado. And so what we get here is a federal system of government. Sometimes we call a federal government federalism. And the definition here, if you want to write this down or keep track of this for later, is federalism is a system of government where power is divided, I'm reading it right here, power is divided between a national, also known as a federal government, and state governments, or sometimes we would call them regional governments, especially when we talk about different countries who might not call these local governments states. They might be territories or regions or provinces. There's lots of different names. Whoa! We're talking about the same thing. So this power is not about one group being more powerful or less powerful like we saw in a unitary system or in a confederate system. It's about specific powers being shared, but also divided, and being clear about which powers are covered by the main national government and which powers are left over for the regional or state governments to cover. Okay? So we got some examples. Obviously, the United States is probably the best example because that's us, right? But there's also other countries that have a federal system of government like Australia, Brazil, Canada, India. And what's interesting about us in the United States is that we've had a bit of a change in our federal system. We used to have a system called dual federalism where the national government and state governments were like really equal. And that's partly why we had things like the Civil War, because there was a struggle over which group was really going to be more powerful than the other. And after the Civil War, it transitioned into a more effective kind of balance of power where it's called cooperative federalism, where the national government is more powerful than states, but we still try to do a good job of defining clearly who has which responsibilities to govern the people who live in in each different part of the country. Now, there's a video right here which I'm not gonna play because I don't know how it would work to have me talking while there's a video playing, and while this person's really cool at drawing, I'm just gonna skip it. Suffice to say, he goes in and he explains what I just said, so you don't really need to watch it. Okay. Now let's talk about some advantages and disadvantages. Now obviously, if I was with you today, we would do a little bit of brainstorming, but let's just kind of get to the point. One of the cool things about the federal system of government, some of the advantages, I'll put them all up here, is that you get this united government, this national government that really truly binds these local governments together, but you're also going to allow these local governments to handle those local problems like we talked about. Mississippi versus Colorado. You've got a U.S. government that binds those two states together. They work together as a team, but at the same time, they're allowed to focus on their own issues. Those local government, number two, they have to be responsive, especially to the people in their communities. So for instance, if something happens in the state of Illinois that we don't like, well, we can do something about that by electing different legislators or a new governor in Illinois. It doesn't have to be, that we dislike something that's happening and we can't change it because it's too far away. It's a much more close to home kind of system. Another thing, number three, is that by having local governments focus on local issues, it's going to allow the national government or the central government to focus on these bigger issues. They can spend their time and their energy on things like, international relationships or war or fixing the national economy, rather than having to worry about, whether or not the streets down the road have been paved in Lake County, okay? we can leave those issues up to the local governments. And one other cool thing is that it means there are more positions for people to serve in government, which makes sense. If we have more layers of government, we will have more literally like job openings, right, for people to serve in government. If there was just one layer, well, you got your president, you got your congressmen and women, you got your Supreme Court justice and everybody who works for them, but well, what about me? I'm not going to become a Supreme Court justice, but maybe I want to serve somewhere. Now I can become maybe a state representative and represent the people in this part of my state. See how that works? Downsides, there's a few. Again, I'll go fast now. Number one, there's a duplication of services. A great example here would be you have, we'll use police as an example. We have Gurnee Police, we have Lake County Police Department, we have the Illinois State Police, and if we want to keep going up, we have national, police. They're not really called police, but like the FBI. You've got all these different layers of policing, and in a federal system, that can be kind of redundant. Sometimes those different areas or those different services can step on each other's toes sometimes. It also, number two, it also means that citizens who are living in different parts of the country will be subject to different types of laws. Again, a state like Colorado, where everybody knows has been legalizing recreational drugs, well, those rules don't apply here. That's not legal here. And so you got different ways of doing things. That's just one example that's been in the news a lot. There's also issues that, that relate to gun control. There's the issue of up until recently at least, it was same-sex marriage. There's many of these big issues, or the death penalty is another big one. Big issues where, you're not going to have the same rules apply to everybody. Sometimes you also get disagreements about which powers should be state powers, which powers should be national powers, and that can be complicated to sort out. And it also means that every now and then a state might get a little, bold and might start to do things that kind of go against what the national government recommends. A great example of that would be the legalization of drugs in states, like I said, like Washington and Colorado and elsewhere. Technically, the federal government doesn't want that to happen. But these state governments have come along and said, you know what, we're going to do it anyway, and then just see what the federal government has to say about that. So there's some disagreements that occur there. And obviously another great one would be the issue of slavery, which then obviously led to the Civil War. That was a huge struggle between state governments and the national government. So I'm getting tired. So let's kind of get to the point. Why does federalism work so well? Why do we have it in this country instead of unitary or confederate, when not specifically as it relates to how diverse we are, but specifically as it relates to democracy? Just to recap, remember, the United States, we have a democracy. And now that we know what a federal system is, we can be more specific and say we have a federal democracy. So democracy is a form of government in which all eligible citizens are meant to participate equally, and our leaders are elected by the citizens. And so what's cool is that having multiple levels of government is going to allow more citizens to serve as leaders. It's also going to help keep our leaders in touch with the communities and the people they're designed to serve. And it allows individual states to simply try things new. If Colorado wants to legalize marijuana, well, we all have our opinion about that, yay or nay. But if they're going to do it, well, let's all watch and see what happens in Colorado over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And if it leads to problems, then I'm glad it didn't happen here. But if it doesn't, well, then maybe that's something that other states are going to look at and start to consider how it could impact them and if they want to change their own policies. So there's lots of cool things about federalism that are positive. Now, here's the thing. We're so close to being done. This is a long video. I apologize. We're really close to being done. But there's one last little detail. And that detail is that I think we need a halftime show to wrap this all up. Okay, here we go. Alright. These are the regular ones. This one's the money, okay? didn't get any that time. Disappointing. That's okay though, and we'll get them next time. Hey everybody, thank you so much for paying attention. I know this was a lot of me talking, a long video to sit through, but I do appreciate it. I hope it made sense, and if you have any questions, you know what to do. You can always ask me or ask somebody who seems to understand it. Here's what you're doing with all this information. Right now, I want you to head over to the Canvas quiz, which has recently been published. It's quiz 206, I think. Let me double check that. 206? 206. 206. So make sure you take that. You can take it one time, so do your best, and that will be all you need to do. I will see you tomorrow when we will continue to talk about the division of power between national government and state governments and how it all works out. Goodbye.